Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and welcome to another edition of RegWatch on GFN.TV. After almost 10 years covering nicotine vaping, what has RegWatch learned? Well, beyond the innumerable insights on key issues, broadly speaking, we've learned that covering the nicotine vaping industry is hard, kind of like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. The effort can be frustrating, if not futile at times, particularly if you are looking for specific data points about the industry, such as how many people vape in the United Kingdom, what are the world's top vapor markets, how many specialty vape retailers are there in the United States, and what is the growth in the worldwide vaping population. Real tough data to hunt down or even to find in one place. Joining us today is a person who holds the key to that data, Barnaby Page, the editorial director at Tamarind Intelligence, a market research firm specialized in providing detailed global market and regulatory analysis in the vaping, cannabis, and tobacco sectors via three brands: e-cig Intelligence, Can Intelligence, and Tobacco Intelligence. Barnaby, thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thanks, Brent. Great to be here.
Well, we appreciate you coming on. I'd like to start with a little background. I know you are a veteran journalist from the old school. Whatever brought you into the vaping space and working with e-cig Intelligence?
Well, I guess my answer to that would be pretty old school as well. I'd like to say that back in 2014, when e-cig Intelligence was founded and when I joined, that I had some great vision of the future and how reduced risk tobacco and nicotine products would transform public health and so on. But in fact, no, I applied for a job. I was at that time covering the digital advertising industry. I had been doing it for quite a while. I was looking for something new. And along came e-cig Intelligence, and this sounded like another interesting, disruptive technology in an interesting industry. And so I went for it. I believe I was the company's first employee. That was just over 10 years ago. We've just celebrated our 10th birthday, in fact.
Was 2014 not seen as quite early in the development of the market for this kind of market analysis to come up?
I guess it was, yeah. I mean, I would characterize it as precisely the time that e-cigarettes was starting to edge into the mainstream, just. They'd been around for a while, but they'd been kind of extremely niche, obscure products that most people had never even heard of. You were just starting to see them around, just starting to see occasional advertising. Some of the bigger companies were starting to get interested. So yeah, I guess it was that time that e-cigarettes sort of poked their head above the parapet, if you like. But it was still a pretty small sector at that point, and it certainly wasn't a sector that had much at all in the way of formal research into it. There had been some scientific research, some medical research, but not a lot. And very, very little done in terms of work on the market itself.
From day one, how difficult was it to cover the e-cigarette industry?
I guess it was in some ways easier than now, I guess, simply because it was smaller. You could probably have called up every e-cigarette brand in a day or two if you wanted to. People would talk to you. People weren't necessarily hidden behind huge walls of flunkies and functionaries. On the other hand, there was very little data, there was very little reliable information of any sort out there. There was quite a lot of misinformation, not put out, with malicious intent, but simply, what few websites existed, for example, are often run by hobbyists and so on. So, it was a whole lot less formal than it is now in every respect, I guess.
Was it back then the Wild West?
Was it the Wild West more than it is now? That's an interesting question. You could certainly argue there are still Wild West aspects to the industry, though the industry as a whole is a much larger, more responsible, serious sector than it was 10 years ago. I guess you'd say there were Wild West aspects to it, but let's not forget, that to extend a metaphor, a lot of the Wild West was about pioneers with, a dream in their heart. And a lot of the e-cigarette industry was about that as well. People in 2014, they were passionate about what they were doing. They were doing it for a reason. So yeah, Wild West in the good sense, perhaps.
So 2014, e-cigarette intelligence started. I mean, we're talking here over over the next couple of years, a critical time in regulation when it comes to both in the EU and the US. You have the Tobacco Products Directive in the EU, and then you've got FDA's deeming rule. How much did these regulatory efforts impact the development of your business?
Well, from our point of view, absolutely massively. I think it would probably be safe to say, in fact, that if the deeming rule and the TPD, the Tobacco Products Directive, had not existed, we probably wouldn't have existed ourselves, or certainly not in the form we do. There had been little smatterings of legislation here and there, but these were the first big pieces of comprehensive or semi-comprehensive regulation aimed at the e-cigarette sector. And since our real speciality has always been looking at the way that regulation influences the market, obviously this was an enormous opportunity for us to interpret what those two pieces of regulation would do, and are still doing to this day.
So today, how many countries do you cover? What areas?
Well, we cover parts of the whole world. We cover certainly every major market and many minor markets. We have quite a number of different products within our overall e-cig intelligence brand. So, for example, we have a database on markets. We have other databases, trackers on regulation and so on. But in round figures, our market database has about 50 countries, and our regulatory coverage has, last time I counted, around 110. So that's pretty much anywhere that has any vaping regulation, and that, we're not just talking, the US, UK, France. That includes Uganda, Kuwait, for example.
Barnaby, without disclosing any tradecraft, how is the intelligence gathered?
Okay, well, it's done through, we have a dedicated market team, a team of market analysts, and we also use some external researchers. So we have people on the ground in many of the countries that we cover. And it's really a mixture of different ways of sourcing information, which could include online research. It could include direct interviews with industry stakeholders. It could include incorporating external market research. It can include sometimes, collaborating with our clients. And then we feed that sort of information into our own databases. Where the numbers are concerned, we then have our own methodology for building up our assessment of what, for example, we believe the value of a certain market is. So, in simple terms, if we're looking at the value of a national e-cigarette market, we want to know how many people vape, and what the pattern of their vaping is, and what the typical prices are of product in that country. We work upwards from the basic facts. So the basic facts would include how many vapers are there, how much do they individually vape, what are the average prices of vaping products in that country, and so on. So what you're getting from us is a fresh and original number created from the basic data. We're not just bringing in other people's estimates.
Barnaby, you've kindly shared some data with us for our audience, and it's pretty exciting stuff. So let's take a look at some of those numbers you're just talking about, and let's start with the world's top vapor markets in sales in 2024. Walk us through that.
Yeah, well, you can see here that the USA, of course, is by far the dominant vapor market in the world. It's around more than 5 times the size of the next biggest, which is the UK. Though it should also be noted in that context that the USA has roughly 5 times the UK's population. So in a per capita sense, they're not actually all that different. Then you've got a bunch of countries around the sort of $1 to $2 billion mark. There's a few more that didn't make it onto this list, but are a bit below. A very interesting country there is Brazil. In fact, another interesting one is China. Brazil, because e-cigarettes are not really legal there. China, because they're very, very tightly controlled in many ways, and yet they still have these big markets. And so you then naturally see, you see a tapering off to smaller and smaller markets. But those big countries, the US, Canada as well, and Western Europe are pretty dominant, along with some Asian countries.
What are the challenges that you guys face when trying to get these numbers? Putting them together, I guess.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess there's a number. One of them is that vapes go through a lot of different channels. So you've got vape stores. Vape stores are often very, very happy to collaborate with our research. We have good relationships with them and have done annual vape store surveys in the United States, for example, for years. But there's a lot of them, and they're very, very different. You could say, they're almost each store is unique. So it's difficult, perhaps, to generalize there. You can't just pick 20 vape stores, look at their experience, and say, okay, this is what we're getting on a national level. Then, of course, you have the convenience store and supermarket sector, much, much more organized, but not necessarily quite so happy to share their sales data with anybody who comes along and asks about it. So we do, of course, look at online sales are quite easy to monitor in a sense. Things like pricing online is transparent. We do in-person store visits as well in a lot of countries, not all of them. But in a lot, we will send people we call trend spotters out to look at individual stores. What we're trying to do now, a big focus for us at the moment, is moving beyond simply saying what has happened in the sector into offering more kind of predictive analysis. What do we think will happen next? Where will it go next?
Let's take a look at the next bit of data here that you shared with us. And this next one is growth in worldwide vaping population. This is really interesting to me. So the number year over year keeps growing. What's fueling that? Well, first talk about the numbers. Those are big numbers. Well,
they are big numbers. Yeah, absolutely. I think you have to sort of bear in mind, of course, the context of them, which is the size of the size of smoking, both in terms of dollars and in terms of number of people. Vaping is still relatively small alongside that, but its growth rate is terrific. And I think that really comes down to three very simple things. The proposition is attractive. We can sometimes lose sight of the wood because we're talking about the trees so much. The basic proposition of a nicotine delivery system that doesn't kill you or doesn't kill you as reliably and efficiently as cigarettes, is a very attractive one to many people. Add to that the fact that vaping has attained quite a high profile, which it didn't have, as I said, 10 years ago when it was just emerging. And then add to that the fact that the product undoubtedly got better. They are more pleasant to use. They're better at nicotine delivery, etc., etc. So I think it's those things, three Ps, if you like: proposition, profile, and product, really, that has driven it. We did see a little blip in the market around the time of the EVALI crisis, but it was pretty quickly overcome. Actually, doesn't seem to have had a very deleterious long-term effect.
Right. From 2019 to 2020, we're looking at a dip of about 4 million users worldwide. But otherwise, it's just straight up like that. 8 years, 40 million additional vapors worldwide.
Absolutely. I mean, clearly, one of the questions now is how long can that line continue in that way? And the picture there is becoming more complex now, of course, because you have other reduced risk products coming onto the market. You have nicotine pouch, which has found favor with a lot of consumers and is becoming more and more widespread pretty quickly. You have heated tobacco, which has already done very well in some countries, notably Japan. Is now almost certainly about to roll out on a big scale in the United States and so on. So we may well see some flattening off of that curve, partly because all curves flatten off in the end anyway, but also because there are other alternatives emerging. But I think there's little doubt that curve is carrying on going upward for the foreseeable future.
Let's take a look now at the growth in worldwide vapor markets. And then there's actually a forecast here that you've made too as well. Walk us through what's here.
Yeah. Okay. So again, this is obviously paralleling the growth in vapor numbers. More consumers are therefore spending more. And yeah, they are big numbers. I think you need to set this again, as I say, alongside the tobacco market, which is worth around 750 billion. So in round figures, you're looking at something like 5% of the value of the tobacco market is what the vapor market is worth. A great deal of that is concentrated in the United States, of course. Again, we went back to that earlier number about market sizes.
So that's interesting. Yeah. So it's a small chunk of the traditional combustible tobacco business. How much is oral tobacco products? I mean, that must be not even a blip yet.
No, I would say it's a tiny blip on the horizon at the moment. But I think come back in 2 or 3 years, and I think you will see. I think you could well see pouch, not at the scale of e-cigarettes, but certainly being noticeable on that chart, as it were. When you compare with the tobacco industry as well, I think it's important to remember that there are a lot of countries in the world, particularly in the global south, where there are still fairly high smoking rates, and basically vapor is not available, or only available to a very limited extent. So when we say that vapor is only about 5% of the tobacco market, we shouldn't assume that is true in every country. In some countries, it may be quite a bit more, because in other countries, it's basically zero or close to.
Yeah. Globally, how much of an impact have bans and restrictions made? Are there quite a number of areas in which that e-cigarettes, you just can't get them?
Yeah, I mean, complete bans are not as widespread as is often believed to be the case. And in fact, let's say that, to put it politely, complete bans, or effectively complete bans, in countries like Brazil and Australia do not necessarily translate into nobody vaping. They just translate into a bunch of people skirting close to the law. I think the bans probably that have had, or the restrictions, shall we say, that have had the most impact generally, are probably not the out-and-out prohibitions, but they are restrictions on product characteristics. So yeah, flavor bans, which have emerged in a lot of places, including in the US, at state and municipal level in a lot of places. And of course, in Europe, the Tobacco Products Directive puts a lot of restrictions, for example, on nicotine strength, on the size of containers and so on. Not to say those kind of rules are always respected, but I think they are pretty widely. So I think you could actually argue that although it's bans and prohibition that gets the headlines, it's actually these product restrictions that really make a difference to what people can go out and buy.
So I guess that is making the argument that vaping as a market is sensitive to regulatory action, is it not?
I think it is, yeah. And that always gets into a kind of question of what if, of course. I would argue that despite the, despite sometimes quite tight regulation, and very often, quite a negative tone of media and public discourse about vaping, I would argue that despite that, the market has continued growing, and that's a really positive sign. But what, of course, we can't say with certainty is, well, how might it have been different if the regulators were more vape friendly, if the media was more vape friendly? Maybe it would have grown twice as much, maybe it wouldn't. So I think we have to sort of acknowledge the limits of our perception there. But yeah, regulation has an impact, but I think people can overstate the, if you like, melodramatic effect of regulation. Flavors bans don't actually kill off markets. They might constrain market growth, for example. But we don't see a market just withering and dying because one product characteristic has been cut off a bit.
But what about if there's a combination of tactics? So you've got flavor ban, you've got, say, maybe new taxation, some kind of an excise tax, and so forth. I mean, at some point, does it not choke the industry out?
I think the real risk is that it reduces the incentive to switch to vaping. I don't think it necessarily turns off all existing vapors, though some with new products like pouch and heated tobacco, some might move there. But it makes the vaping proposition less attractive for smokers. So for example, if taxation's a really good example. If you tax vapor as highly as combustible tobacco, which is not normally the case, but if you do, that's already one of the big attractions of vapor is just wiped out. And so you can imagine that doing a few things such as that, would indeed make it very difficult for a lot of people to build up the motivation to switch. Those who were purely motivated by health reasons, yes, would. But we know that consumers are not entirely rational; they behave emotionally as well, and you want to move to a nice product.
So Barnaby, tell us a little bit about the challenges around the illicit market, because certainly where there is major restrictions and regulations, an illicit market pops up, and obviously you have the disposables issue, which I'm sure you've got something to say on that. So, I mean, how do you track the illicit market and how big is it? And is that included in these numbers in terms of sales, country sales?
I think the thing to remember there is different kinds of illicit. There are, you can argue that a lot of e-cigarettes sold through vape stores in the United States, for example, are illicit in a sense because, according to the strict letter of the FDA rules, they should not actually be on sale now. But the FDA has more or less said, they're not in so many words, it's, that it's not always going to enforce this. And so, some illicit products or supposedly illicit product like that would be included in market totals. Then you have product, that is, of a quite different kind, that is, say, genuinely smuggled across national borders, perhaps sold on street markets, something like that. That's generally not going to make it into market size figures. Because nobody is tracking the retailer there. And from the original brand manufacturer's point of view, the products weren't intended to end up in that country.
So what's going to happen in the UK with the, disposables ban? One, can they effectively ban disposables from the island? And two, if they can, what's going to happen?
Well, can they? Yes, I think the UK, in fact, being an island, is in a relatively good position to ban disposables, because it's going to be it would be very difficult, I think, for mainland European countries to do so because their borders are just so porous. Now, obviously, there's nothing stopping somebody bringing 20 or 100 or 1,000 disposables, back in their suitcase. But it makes it a bit harder to bring 2 million disposables in. There is an interesting question mark over the border with Ireland, of course, there. That comes up as an issue even with disposable e-cigarettes. In terms of what will replace disposables, well, I mean, we're already seeing, and not just in the UK, we're seeing everywhere, kind of hybrid products that I call quasi-disposables, which have many of the consumer attraction of disposables, so they're relatively easy to use, etc., straightforward, simple products, but you can refill them, you can recharge them, so they're not actually disposable. Now, it's quite possible, I think, that these products would have emerged anyway, actually, even if there hadn't been disposable bans, that these were the obvious next step. But the disposable issue certainly is it's a big one at the moment, because, of course, it brings together two issues. It brings together the issue of underage vaping, which has, perennially been center stage, in many countries. With the much newer issue of the environmental impact of waste, of electronics waste.
Barnaby, you'll be hosting a workshop at the upcoming Global Forum on Nicotine, the annual conference on safer nicotine products and tobacco harm reduction. GFN 24 runs from this June 13 to 15 in Warsaw, Poland. Let me ask you, why is an event like GFN important?
I think GFN itself is important for a number of reasons. One of them is very simple, and it lies in the name. It's the fact that it's the Global Forum on Nicotine, not the forum on smoking or the forum on e-cigarettes or for that matter, the forum on freedom to vape or the forum on preventing smoking or anything. it doesn't, though it is undoubtedly, broadly speaking, a pro harm reduction event. It doesn't start out with a very strong agenda in that direction, and it doesn't only focus on one form of nicotine. It looks at everything. Inevitably, e-cigs are a big part of that. Inevitably. I think it's important as well because it brings together people from a lot of different disciplines. So there's a lot of public health people there, but you get industry people there as well. You'll get people from vaping advocacy groups. You'll get some regulators and so on and so forth. And I think in this area, as in any, but it's certainly very true in the vaping world, it's really important that those groups communicate. There's a lot of echo chambers, and we spend a lot of time with one of us sitting in one corner of the room saying vapes are wonderful, and then a group sitting over in the other corner saying, oh my God, vapes are terrible. And they never really talk to each other. And they might actually have more common ground than they thought they did. And I think events like GFN, try to provide that.
Barnaby, final question. If you could highlight one piece of data that should provide some hope to all the vapors out there, what would it be?
Well, I'm going to be pretty boring, and I'm going to actually go back to one of the slides you showed earlier. And I would say either of those pieces of data that simply shows the virtually unstoppable growth of vaping. I think that confirms more vividly than anything else, that it's now something that's here to stay. It's not going to be regulated out of existence tomorrow. There may be little challenges in the future. Of course, the products may transform. Who knows what they'll be like 5-10 years from now. But I think we can now say pretty emphatically, vaping is not, as you might have thought in 2014, a fad that's going to disappear overnight. It's something that's with us for the long run, as indeed are all other forms of tobacco harm reduction as well now.